Welcome to Case 3, Enterprise Risk Management at Hydro One. Myself, Pedro, Robert, and Thomas will be giving you an overview. We'll go through Hydro One's history, the company position, strategy and objectives, advantage and threats, the ERM process, ERM at Hydro One versus Jet Propulsion Laboratories, Gentry Lee versus John Fraser, and Enterprise Risk Management, the big picture. Ontario Hydro was founded in 1906 in Toronto, Ontario. It's an electric power generation company at Niagara Falls. In 1998, Ontario Hydro became two organizations. One was a power generation utility business called Ontario Power Generation. The second was a combined transmission and delivery business called Hydro One. Hydro One was divided up into three sub-organizations. These were transmission, distribution, and telecommunications. In 1998, the Ontario government deregulated the electric power industry. This caused Hydro One's board to work towards becoming a public company through an initial public offering. They estimated that they would raise $5.5 billion. Preparing for the IPO, Hydro One implemented some new business practices. They were going to focus on being very consumer-focused. There were cost-cutting measures, enterprise risk management, performance management, and strategy planning. In 2002, the IPO was canceled 2 weeks prior to the planned date due to media and political controversy. Hydro One decided that they would continue to focus on their past business practices, but also place a primary focus on enterprise risk management, risk-based investment planning, and working to achieve a balanced scorecard focusing on customer service. In 2002, the Ontario Energy Board capped distribution revenues at $4 billion for the next 5 years. This resulted in Hydro One really needing to focus on efficiency and cost-cutting initiatives. In 2005, Hydro One's long-term debt was upgraded to A and A2, which helped to improve their financial position. They also continued to focus on conservation initiatives through their power cost monitors, which showed their customers real-time spending, and through their smart meters, which showed time of use rates and induced smart pricing. The strategy at Hydro One was that they wanted to be the best transmission and distribution business in North America. They would do this through achieving the best safety record in the world, top transmission and distribution reliability, 90% customer satisfaction, top employee productivity, operating efficiency, and an A credit rating. Some advantages that Hydro One had was there was limited competition in their industry. They had an experienced and engaged leadership team. They had a formalized enterprise risk management plan and strategic initiatives, and they achieved customer satisfaction rates from 82 to 86% in 2006. Some of the threats that Hydro One faces are regulatory risk through the government involvement, financial risks of high operating costs, rate approvals, and a revenue cap, operational risk through capacity of Hydro One systems beginning to decline, reputational risks through the negative publicity from workforce reductions and previous CEOs' departures, natural hazard risks, which is the weather, and consumer demand and knowledge.
The ERM process leads to better decision-making to achieve the company's goals. Be better prepared to face the risk of the business and save money in the long run. The program was implemented at first as a requirement of the Toronto Exchange. The company was planning to go public, and to do so, it had to comply with the requirements and regulations established. This aided in the management of bottom-line expenses, especially when you're a company that is being capped at a certain amount of revenues. The program helped manage the risk landscape, improving awareness of the strategic objectives throughout every department of the firms, achieving a general understanding of the principal risks faced by the organization. The RM process consisted of 3 phases: a risk workshop as phase 1, phase 2 was reviewing the corporate risk profile, and phase 3, the risk-based appraisal and planning. In the phase one of the ERM process, the idea was to create workshops that would put together a cross-functional team of experts of every area of the business to pull together a list of the major risks they felt the company faced. A list of 60 to 70 potential risks would emerge from these workshops. By sharing and learning from each other's point of view, the list would be filtered throughout an evaluation of probability versus impact to narrow it down to 8 to 10 most critical risks. These workshops aided in the open communication across managers of different departments, which helped mitigate either the probability or impact of the risk evaluated. The more information managers shared of their experiences, the better informed the workshop would be to make better decisions. Because you get people from different backgrounds together in a room to address individual risks previously identified, the perspective of how to view each risk was modeled to an open discussion that allowed managers to be more open about their concerns. Their anonymity of the discussion table also created a safe environment for the team to express themselves freely without any judgment. In phase two, part of the monitoring phase, twice a year Fraser would prepare a company risk profile as a baseline to address in the meeting. The idea is to evaluate where the company is at this point in time and review if there are any changes in the previously identified risk. Have they been mitigated or do they need more attention? Has there been new developments that have created new risks for the firm? Or have there been previously identified risks that were not prioritized before that might have scaled to a higher level of risk? To achieve this, Fraser presented a 2-page headline news to managers of the last 6 months and a summary of previous corporate risk profiles. With an empty template, the meeting would start by asking what has changed. These meetings were very important because risks are not static and they constantly change. In phase 3, managers would set priorities of the maintenance and building programs of the identified risks. They evaluate each investment proposals in terms of cost and severity of the mitigation plan. Fraser would argue that maintaining a risk management point of view gave managers a higher ability and scrutiny to capital expenditure planning and reassured that the firm was going in the right direction.
Now that we have covered Hydro One's position and ERM program, we can compare Hydro One with JPL from the first case study. First, let's start with the similarities. I chose to compare the two companies and find their similarities using Sim Siegel's 10 criteria for good ERM from the Lecture 6 series. The first criteria was enterprise-wide scope. The ERM had to be all-encompassing. Hydro One made sure that it was all-encompassing by making the risk the responsibility of every employee, as kind of detailed in the ERM process in the previous slides. JPL set Lee as the chief systems engineer so he could implement his risk management program across all JPL planetary missions. The second criteria is all risk categories should be included in the ERM. Hydro One did a risk poll and risk workshop, as mentioned before, and then they voted and argued over which risks were the most important. JPL created the preliminary mission and systems review to rule out all risks associated with a new mission. The third criteria is key risk focus. You can't focus on all your risks, so you just got to focus on the key ones that are absolutely important to your organization. I think both organizations used risk maps and weighted their risk using the frequency and severity of those risks. Both organizations set limits on their risks to help them decide which risks to focus on. They set an upper limit that usually was called the red zone in both case studies. The next criteria is that the ERM should be integrated across risk types. You don't want to have your financial risk separate from your regulatory risk, etc. Both organizations stress communication to prevent these type of silos. The next criteria is aggregated metrics. Both organizations aggregated the risk data across the company or project to see what the overall risk profile was. The next criteria is that the ERM should include decision making. We saw earlier in the ERM program for Hydro One that the information, part of the ERM program, flows the information for risks up to management where they meet periodically to review those risks and make decisions. The same thing happened at JPL in a series of 4 or 5 reviews of each project and each subset of the project to make sure that they were still continuing to address the risks appropriately. The next criteria was balances risk and return. The ERM program has to balance the risk and return of the businesses. Hydro One did this by doing a risk-based investment appraisal to make sure that they were getting the bang for their buck that they wanted. JPL did this by assigning cost and time reserves to their highest priority risk for that particular mission, and then reviewing it on a regular basis. The next criteria was that the ERM program should measure the value it had, its impact on the business. Hydro One did this using their objective impact matrix, which we'll see a little later in the slideshow. JPL did a final risk review before launch, and that risk review considered the remaining risks and likelihood of mission. Gentry Lee mentions in the case study that the review board generally was comfortable going ahead if the likelihood was estimated to be 90% or greater, and they were a little concerned if it wasn't. The final criteria was primary stakeholder focus. Both organizations could not forget why they were doing what they were doing. For Hydro One, they made customer satisfaction a priority, and they always kept regulators in mind. JPL considered the U.S. public and Congress as stakeholders and factored them into the ultimate. Now that we've done similarities, we can focus on the differences. Most of those differences boil down to the fact that Hydro One and JPL are in different industries, that they had different cultures, and that they were facing different risks, and that the culture, industry, and risks informed and changed the risk program at both of those organizations. Take, for example, engineers versus utility professionals. Engineers have a very different view of the world. They are very good with numbers, and so their ERM program definitely seemed more quantitative when we read the case study, versus Hydro One. They had quantitative aspects to their ERM program, but it mentions in the case study that they specifically vote with their gut, and that John Fraser said that it is a subjective rather than an objective exercise when they evaluated their risks. The next one was space exploring, new frontiers versus utility production. Space is new, no one's done it before, and so JPL was facing risks that no one else had faced before, versus utility production. Hydro One had been in business for over 100 years and could draw on that experience. And they also could go around the world and look at all their competitors or all the other utility producers around the world and copy them and use them as examples. And that kind of summarized the third bullet point as well. We have been focusing in the last couple slides on how the culture, industry, and the risks of those industries affects the ERM program. However, ERM also changes the culture. It goes both ways. So Hydro One, both companies, in fact, Hydro One and JPL, the main goal was to make risk awareness throughout the whole organization, and that was by creating a culture that was risk aware. And also because risk assessment was somewhat subjective, as mentioned before, they wanted to allow different perspectives to inform that risk, the risk profiles, and ultimately the decision-making process. Because information was critical to assessing the risk of each firm, it had to flow through the firm smoothly and without any barriers. So Hydro One made sure that they made it an efficient process going up and down the company, and made sure that information flowed up to the C-suite where ultimately they can make the best decisions. John Fraser did this by encouraging people to talk about their risks and tying that specifically to their departmental funding. If a manager, for example, said, "Hey, I don't have any risk," Fraser would say, "Oh, okay, well then I won't give you any money, and we will instead move that money to somebody who does have risk." And that got people talking. In other words, this made it risk management everyone's responsibility. Everyone had an incentive to become part of the risk management program and to to make sure they were taking a good look at their risks. We could also compare not only the organizations, Hydro One and JPL, but we can compare the two main players in the risk programs in both companies, Gentry Lee versus John Fraser. Let's start with their backgrounds. Gentry Lee was an engineer who had experience working at JPL, and the missions that he worked on were successful, didn't have any mission failures. So that's why he got the job. John Fraser, on the other hand, was a career risk manager, and that was his whole job, that was his focus. Their jobs was also very different. Gentry Lee was the chief systems engineer, and it just happened to be that his job focus had a risk management element to it. John Fraser, on the other hand, was a CRO, and that was his entire job. Their authority also differed. The ultimate decision to launch came down to Gentry Lee, whereas John Fraser had to convince the rest of the C-suite, and particularly the CEO, on whether or not to pursue a particular project. Despite those above differences, their risk management ultimately had a lot of similarities. Both men still made risk awareness as pervasive as possible in their organizations. Both men were authentic. They walked the walk. And both men tailored their ERM to fit their organizations. What all this comparison kind of boils down to is that there are some main things that influence ERM, particularly the industry. Different industries face different risks. Those risks in those industries will have different historical data and frequency and severity ratings. For example, Gentry Lee was leading a mission that contained tasks that no one had ever done before, as mentioned before, and so he couldn't really use historical data. John Fraser, on the other hand, had 100 years of business to draw upon. Conversely, John Fraser's industry changed quickly. New regulations or lawsuits with First Nations could change their risk profile in a day. Gentry Lee, on the other hand, faced physical and engineering risks that rarely changed. It would take an Einstein to come and change those physical laws of the universe. Their organization also influenced the ERM program. The cultures of the organization, we mentioned engineers versus utility producers before. Finally, even though there are influencers, the basic principles of ERM still were there. You could modify the ERM, but the main goal still remains the same.
So over the past couple of slides, we've really been talking about what made Hydro One's ERM program successful. There's an additional aspect to all ERM programs, something that's quite difficult for a lot of companies to solve, and that's how to make the cost justifications of not only implementing an ERM program, but also to continue to maintain that program and develop that program as the risk profile and risks always change over time. So we wanted to take a quick look at how do you measure the value of this ERM? What would be something that you could do to really pitch this to your finance organizations to make sure that these programs can be implemented. What we came up with is to actually attempt to quantify both the cost of each scenario as well as the likelihood of it occurring. Now Hydro One, as it's been mentioned before, is fortunate in the sense that a lot of its risks are relatively small, but they also occur a lot. So they should have a good idea of how much it costs to fix things when they go wrong, if a transformer breaks or power lines go down, as well as some idea of the probability of these things occurring. Now, once you have a decent idea of that, you can compare it to the cost of implementing the ERM recommendation. So, be that maintenance, be it new technology, whatever that recurring monthly cost would be. And once you have both of those, you can start to create a risk tolerance map that expands upon more of a qualitative one and actually puts some numbers behind it. Now, the idea would be similar to the old adage that it's better to spend more up front to buy something high quality rather than always having to buy new when that always breaks. So we may have to put more money up front, we may have more ongoing costs, but we can avoid those catastrophic risk situations that end up costing large sums of money. So we went ahead and grabbed, this is the risk map that was pulled from the case study. We think this is a good start. It helps identify those risks and some of the severities. What we would do is then actually go and take that a step further and actually start to put some probabilities behind the worst case, the severe, the major, the moderate risks to actually be able to model that out. as well as walk through and come up with the actual costs of each of these things occurring. So if we think we're going to lose customers, how many customers are we losing? What does that do to our revenue stream? Things like that. By putting hard numbers behind all of those, or at least attempting to, you can start to build out a model that makes it a little bit easier for a CFO to swallow the cost and agree with continuing to implement or maintain that ERM process. As we've talked a lot about throughout this presentation, Hydro One's ERM was a really successful ERM. So we wanted to point out 4 of the main keys to success that we came up with. The first is that they distinctly understood that an ERM must reflect the unique culture and the structure of the firm. So this ERM was tailored differently than JPL's was to really leverage everything that Hydro One had available to it to really make that program a success. One of those things they leveraged is really realizing that they had in-house knowledge of the risks that the firm faced. They didn't need to go hire consultants or bring outside people in. They had a lot of people within the company that inherently understood the risks and the difficulties associated with those. They also really took a holistic approach that brought a wide variety of perspectives to the table. So rather than have a risk department with risk managers and risk associates doing all this work, they actually went out to the folks that have boots on the ground that interact with this stuff every single day and brought them into a room to help come up with those risks. So it was very holistic, very broke down a lot of silos and really focused on communication. And then not only were the risks, but also the solutions were crowdsourced, allowing for a more creative solution pool. Rather than just a small group of people coming up with solutions, they opened it up to the group. So everyone got to participate. You know, you could get new ideas out of left field that maybe were a great idea and maybe were a terrible idea, but at least it got out there and everyone was able to discuss it on its merits. So going forward, we're kind of tasked with coming up with some ideas of what Hydro One could do to expand and make this program better. So as I said, we think that their risk program is off to a good start. However, it's a little bit reactive rather than proactive. It's really responding to things that come up or things that have happened in the past. So things breaking down, customer risk, things like that. We think the next step would try to drive that more forward-looking. Some of that would be through some probability analysis and things like that, but also using art markets to hedge against future risks. So coming up with more creative ways to finance that would really allow them to streamline the process and remove a lot of the volatility from their returns so they can make better investment decisions going forward. We wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to our presentation. We'll be posting some questions to get the discussion started in the discussion board, so please feel free to join us over there to continue this discussion. Thank you.